Hi again and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. You might remember last time I said I'd be getting in my next episode to this question of how we action Platonic love. We'd been talking, of course, about this image of the ladder that is at the heart of Plato's teaching on love and desire, and really the key to a happier and better life in the Platonic tradition. It's the central image, really, of Plato's teaching on Eros, and for that reason, it's the central image of this entire video series on Platonic love. And of course, Diotima has told us it's possible to move up this ladder. Yet, I don't think she's been entirely clear on how we actually do that, how we take the steps we need to go about loving platonically. And I think one of the things that contributes to her perhaps not being entirely clear in this has to do again with what we talked about in recent episodes, these kind of absurdities that reveal themselves if we stick to a really strict and inflexible, if you like, perhaps humorless understanding of Diotima's latter image. Life just isn't really like this neat sequence of discrete stages defined by how we conceptualize the object of our love and desire, in which we graduate from one to the next. I think it's hard to take seriously, for example, the idea that we would simply move on from all and any appeal of physical beauty and pass over solely to the admiration of the psyche. And of course, her ladder presents us, at least in its lower rungs, with that narrower understanding of Eros as basically sexual. It ignores that wider sense she had introduced of Eros as denoting love and desire as such in all their manifestations. What our love lives, or our desire lives, if you like, instead seem to present us with is myriads and myriads of choices of all kinds every day. You could call them ethical choices, but also aesthetic choices. We're talking about choices having to do with the good and the beautiful, all that which we're drawn to. And I guess some people perhaps don't really hope for or imagine a discernible progression here. There's just a hope that in each of these cases we somehow make the best choice possible. But if we're Platonists, I think we can still see at work here, even if not in the perhaps simplistic and maybe kind of tongue-in-cheek way that Diotima has presented it, what's essential about the ladder of Eros. That is, in a word, the idea of psychic, or if you like, spiritual ascent. Through all this hurly-burly of daily life with its infinite choices, we can still hope, I think, for a progressive understanding of the ultimate object of our desire. And that's really what she's trying to get at. Specifically, the progressive understanding, that the ultimate object beyond all these objects of sense and thought that preoccupy us and that we chase after is paradoxically not itself an object, as I have a habit of repeating in this series, but rather that absolute good that transcends the subject-object distinction. It's that absolute unity of objective and subjective being, all of which sounds a bit abstract, perhaps, but I'm talking about glimpses of what we experience, for example, in the pure, you could say, pure forms of love, when the good of the beloved other seems identical to our own, or there's even a sense of confusion of identity between lover and beloved in some way. In these instances, often faster than we can be aware of them, I think, often, we experience the transcendence of the subject-object divide. And we saw Sigmund Freud notice this phenomenon without, in my opinion anyway, being able to really deeply explain it, though, because he was stuck in the realm of purely objective science. About a millennium and a half earlier, St. Augustine, after being converted to Platonism in what he kind of depicts as a sort of necessary pre-conversion for his eventual conversion or reconversion back to Christianity. He made this connection between what you could call, if you like, sort of high mysticism of the visionary with the, in a way, everyday mysticism of love in his Confessions, because he talked there about the absolute unity of being, as Plato does, in terms of a psychic or spiritual light. He wrote, "He who knows the truth knows that light, and he that knows it knows eternity. Love knows it. Amor novit eum," one of those sentences that astound us, or some of us, for containing so much, expressed so simply. There's a sense in which mundane life, or at least the life we may take to be mundane, can hold these moments of minor, if you like, mysticism, these minor ecstasies, these moments of love that our love lives contain or involve, or certainly can contain or involve, kind of mysticism or transcendence that we might even perhaps take for granted. So we can move upward, and this upward movement is progressive, as Diotima had put forth, or it can be, because surely behind the less good choices we make about love and desire are the various habits we've built up of objectifying, or if you like, habitualizing the good, the often unconscious reasons why we do this. And we can progressively divest ourselves of these false ideas through a kind of spiritual therapy. We're like the sea god Glaucus that Plato talks about toward the end of the Republic, but we have the power to free ourselves from all these encrustations that have hidden our true nature and kept us from seeing our, in a way, infinite potential to be better and happier, to reproduce in the beautiful, as Diotima herself so beautifully put it. So, for example, we may have habituated ourselves, perhaps even over decades, to a certain kind of lesser happiness we experience in safety, to the point where perhaps we've developed a habit of making fixed judgments about other people because these judgments make us feel less vulnerable. They feel protective in some way. Opening ourselves up to the truth, which is always going to be infinitely nuanced and infinitely resist rigid judgment, is often, perhaps always, going to feel like a bit of a risk. But there can be real progress in divesting ourselves of this habit, because opening ourselves more to the full truth of other people is really the only way we're going to be able to glimpse that beauty of the psyche that Diotima speaks of as a higher stage of eros. And so this is how I see us climbing this ladder, that these discoveries about ourselves, these purgings, I guess, of these irrational and often unconsciously held beliefs can act as catalysts for progressively raising our love lives, or our desire lives, to higher levels, to a progressive ability to glimpse that light that Plato and Augustine had spoken of, and a pleasure in seeing this light in other souls and in our relationships with them may become even increasingly habitual for us. Actually, it's long been a theory of mine that much of our Western culture, especially perhaps our fiction, has to do with this theme, this shifting of desire, this ascent of individuals to a new understanding, a new light, due to this cathartic work they've been doing of divesting themselves of false assumptions about love and desire and about what's good in life. In other words, I'm hypothesizing really that much of Western culture has been about illustrating Diotima's ladder in some way. But in one of the wondrous ways history often happens, that this is being done unconsciously, i.e. you could call this part of the reception of Plato, though Plato, for the most part, is probably the last thing on these people's minds, and many of them may have no actual direct understanding of him, or would say they're the least bit concerned with him. I mean, all these artists who have been in their way illustrating the latter. But I think there are far, far more of these sort of secret passages in history than we're aware. And I think this may be one of them, and maybe one of the most important of them. And I think it would be fun if one ever had time to sort of recreate how this came to happen in our culture. But anyway, the important thing is that we have the power to ascend psychically or spiritually through our letting go of these assumptions that no doubt have a hold on us and that manifest themselves in the myriad decisions we make every day in our love and desire lives. You may have noticed that I still haven't fully answered, however, this question that I asked at the beginning of how we actually do this. At least I don't think I have yet. The question is actually asked by Plotinus also in his own way, who opens his tractate on dialectic with the question, what art is there, what method, what discipline to bring us there where we must go? I think it's an interesting little tractate, even though at times it seems less than perfectly cogent to me. But part of what Plotinus seems to be doing here, to me anyway, is arguing against this idea of a one-size-fits-all ladder of eros, basing his argument on what Plato himself says in the Phaedrus about human psyches ascending differently according to their different natural dispositions. And then, of course, another big part of what he's talking about in this tractate is the essential role of dialectic in this process. It's by means of a rational process that the psyche is cleared of its preconceptions about the good and thereby enabled to ascend. And it seems clear in this passage that for Plotinus, the ascent of the psyche depends on there being a teacher to guide the ascendant soul. Probably also what Plato had in mind in the Symposium, because we'll recall Diotima talks a few times in her speech about these steps that the psyche takes, what she calls these rites of eros, being done correctly, if the lover is being guided correctly, and ean orthos hegetai ha hegumenos, if the leader is leading properly. All this said, I think it's worth asking, so that presupposes there's a leader. I think it's worth asking whether or to what extent a guide, in this sense, like a philosophical teacher, some sort of Socrates figure, in the form of an actually present human being, is necessary in this process. Is it possible that the hegumenos, the leader in these mystical rites of eros, can be understood as eros itself? After all, Plato's fond of talking about the dependence of all knowledge, of all reasoning, on our knowledge of the good, which, of course, is the ultimate object of eros. Is it possible that we can make our ascent guided not so much by another human teacher, but by those glimpses of the good that our own eros has guided us to? We've heard Socrates say in the Phaedrus that the psyche is something of a seer, and in the Republic that all of us spend our lives like seers, trying to discern this ultimate good for whose sake we do everything we do. We've also talked about how, in his 7th letter, Plato seems to suggest that this is possible at least in the case of some people who have become especially familiar with the principle of his philosophy, for it to be generated in the soul and become self-sustaining in this striking phrase of his, quote, like a blaze kindled by a leaping spark. I think in the centuries that followed Plato's own time, this tendency to see the psyche as able to liberate itself by looking into itself became stronger. It's something we see in Stoicism, for example, exemplified in the beautiful words of Marcus Aurelius, quote, "Look within, there is the fountain of good, and it will ever bubble up if you will only dig," unquote. And we actually see this theme taken up by Plotinus, whose thinking, we'll remember, was influenced, according to his student Porphyry, by the Stoics. In his tractate on beauty, Plotinus talks about seeing the vision of the absolute good or beautiful within by the necessity of trying to eliminate any ugliness in our own psyche so that we may glimpse in some way the good or one there ourselves. He writes, "If you have become this and have seen it and find yourself in a purified state, you have no impediment to becoming one in this way, nor do you have something else mixed in with yourself. But you are entirely yourself, true light alone, neither measured by magnitude, nor reduced by a circumscribing shape, nor expanded indefinitely in magnitude, but being unmeasured everywhere, as something greater than every measure and better than every quantity. If you see that, you have become this. At that moment, you have become sight, and you can be confident about yourself, and you have at this moment ascended here, no longer in need of someone to show you. Just open your eyes and see, for this alone is the eye that sees the great beauty." Quite a passage, though. And here we really have the soul completely freed of all of those incrustations that make it resemble that sea underwater God. Though I think, most of us reading this today will sense a certain danger here, perhaps in taking we ourselves to be capable of judging ourselves to be in this purified state, or even, of course, whether such a state is actually possible. I mean, it's kind of not really easy to imagine a life in which the soul isn't, at least to some extent, divided against itself. This is something I want to come back to in the next episode or two. There's at least one more challenge here, I think, that I'd like to talk about now. What could Plotinus mean by coming to this knowledge of the good or one, really? He's told us elsewhere in his Enneads that we paradoxically reach this knowledge through a kind of radical skepticism about it, by refusing to attribute anything to it, by refusing to, in a way, think of it at all. I think the same daimon, you could say, perhaps moved the great Bengali writer Rabindranath Tagore. As I've mentioned before in this series, Tagore wrote in his 1916 novel, The Home and the World, quote, "If we try to shape the good as so much mere material, it takes a terrible revenge by losing its life." And I think he meant not just physical material, but material for thinking. And at the end of a tractate called The Knowing Hypostases and the Transcendent, Plotinus is strikingly concise about how, in his view, the psyche actions this knowledge of the good, or one, that undergirds all its knowledge and its reasoning, including, presumably, that dialectic that would guide the psyche in its ascent. He uses a sentence of two Greek words, aphele panta, take away everything. So, This is a purely negative directive. How are we to be brought to any kind of cognition of the good by a commandment to know nothing, or at least to divest ourselves of our tools for thinking? At this point, we may possibly feel ourselves in kind of desperate need. We need to know or perceive the good in some way for our assent, yet we can't think about it. If only we had some sort of sensor for picking up the good. And it would have to be, if you like, an analog rather than a digital sensor, since it would have to have that sort of analog quality of not being expressible or at least reducible to pure quantity or anything speakable. It would have to be immediate, since anything we can say of the good, anything that would use this medium of language, as we just heard from Plotinus, is not going to help us and needs to be taken away. This sensor I'm talking about may sound like something from science fiction, and yet we do have precisely this sort of sixth sense. We have these other five senses for picking up sound, light, taste, etc. And then we have this sixth sense for picking up the good. And I may be going out on a limb here. What I'm talking about may require something like the development of doctrines which are really only in Plato in kind of germ form. I think they are, though they're developed increasingly explicitly by his followers. But I still may be talking about the development or the need for the development of something like a Neoplatonism. Anyway, that's what I'll be looking at next time, and I hope you can join me then. And until then, be well, and thanks for watching.